This story is titled, Mom and Dad announced at a party they had sold my expensive car to fund my golden brother's honeymoon, who then mocked me for being a pedestrian. But I already had a revenge plan in motion. Hey everyone, I'm a 31-year-old man, and it's finally time to tell my story. I've been holding this in for too long, and I think writing it out might help me process everything that happened. Growing up in my house was like living with a drill sergeant. Not just any drill sergeant, but one who worshipped his star recruit. My younger brother Tommy, who's now 29. That kid was treated like a gift from heaven from the moment he was born. Meanwhile, I received what I can only describe as the disappointment special every single day of my childhood. My dad was one of those men who genuinely believed yelling could fix everything. In his mind, manning up was the universal solution to all of life's problems, from broken bones to mental health issues. Nothing was ever serious enough to warrant actual care or concern, just a lecture about toughening up and pushing through the pain. My mom wasn't any better. She constantly took Tommy's side and made endless excuses for his behavior. "Tommy is just sensitive," she would say with a sympathetic frown. "Tommy needs extra support," was another favorite line of hers. Meanwhile, I couldn't even get a ride to school when it was pouring rain outside. I still remember having to walk 3 miles during a thunderstorm because my mom was busy driving Tommy to his baseball practice. The downpour was so heavy I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. And by the time I arrived at school, I was soaked to the bone. I got really sick after that. High fever, terrible cough, the works. Dad's response? He called me weak for missing school, saying I needed to build up my immune system instead of hiding under the covers. Tommy knew exactly what he was doing through all of this. That little manipulator would wait until our parents weren't looking, then break my stuff and blame it on me. When I was 15, he deliberately deleted my science project from the family computer the night before it was due. I had spent weeks working on it, and in an instant, it was gone. When I tried to explain what happened to my teacher, she gave me detention, saying I was making excuses for not completing my assignment. Another time, Tommy stole $200 I had saved up from mowing lawns all summer. I had been stashing the cash in a small wooden box in my closet, saving for a new bike. When I discovered the empty box hidden in his room and went to confront him about it, he ran crying to Mom, claiming I had gone through his stuff for no reason. He accused me of lying about the theft, and Mom searched his room like she was blindfolded, somehow missing the brand new gaming console he had bought with my money. The favoritism was so obvious it was almost comical. My older sister Rebecca, who's 32 now, saw everything that was happening. She was smart enough to stay under the radar, but she would give me these knowing looks across the dinner table when Dad was screaming at me for not trimming the hedges perfectly or for getting a B instead of an A on a test. She understood how messed up our family dynamic was, but I don't blame her for not stepping in. Dad had this special way of making people regret standing up to him, and she was just trying to survive, same as me. My dad had this whole philosophy about raising real men, which basically meant treating me like trash, while Tommy got everything handed to him on a silver platter. I remember when I was 15, Dad made me rebuild our entire backyard deck in the middle of July, with temperatures hitting 95 degrees. The wood was splintering, the nails were rusting, and I had to tear it all down and rebuild it from scratch. Meanwhile, Tommy was inside playing Xbox with the AC on full blast, occasionally coming to the window to smirk at me as I worked. During that project, I actually passed out from heat exhaustion. The world went sideways, and next thing I knew, I was face down on the half-demolished deck. Dad's solution? He dumped a bucket of ice water on me, told me to stop being dramatic, and ordered me to get back to work. Real Father of the Year material right there. School was my only escape from the nightmare at home. I was actually pretty good at academics, especially chemistry and engineering. My teachers would often tell me I had real potential, that I could go far if I applied myself. They would write encouraging comments on my assignments and suggest advanced programs or competitions I could enter. But Dad couldn't care less about my academic achievements. The only time he ever looked at my report card was when I got a C+ in world history one semester. He gave me this huge lecture about embarrassing the family name and how I was throwing away my future. Meanwhile, Tommy was barely passing any of his classes. He'd bring home D's and the occasional C, and my parents would praise him for trying his best. If he managed to scrape a B in anything, they'd celebrate like he'd won a Nobel Prize. Mom would make his favorite dinner, and Dad would brag about it to anyone who would listen. The double standard was mind-boggling. When I turned 18, everything got even worse. Dad dropped this bomb on me that I had to start paying rent. $600 a month plus utilities and groceries. This wasn't some nominal amount to teach me responsibility. It was market rate for our area. Tommy? He didn't have to pay a single cent. He didn't even have to clean his own room or do any chores around the house. Dad's excuse was that Tommy needed to focus on his baseball scholarship, like I wasn't busting my ass in school and trying to plan for college too. So there I was, trying to finish my senior year while working 2 different jobs, stocking shelves at a grocery store in the mornings before school and waiting tables at a local diner in the evenings. I was pulling 35, 40 hours a week on top of my classes, often getting home after midnight only to wake up at 5 a.m. to do it all over again. My grades started slipping because I simply didn't have time to study. I was getting maybe 4 hours of sleep per night, and I started getting these killer migraines that would leave me nauseated and seeing spots. Dad predictably said I was being weak. He told me to toughen up and stop complaining, that this was what adulthood was all about. By graduation, I looked like a walking corpse. I had lost about 25 pounds since the beginning of the year, and I had these dark circles under my eyes that made me look like I'd been in a fight. Some of my teachers actually pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay at home. But what could I say? That my father was charging me rent while I was still in high school? That I was working myself to exhaustion to pay bills while my younger brother lived like a prince? Mom would occasionally act concerned about my appearance when Dad wasn't around. She'd make comments about how tired I looked or ask if I was eating enough. But she never actually did anything to help. She never confronted Dad about his treatment of me or offered to reduce my rent burden. Her concern was all talk, no action. Tommy would just smirk when Dad made comments about how I wasn't pulling my weight around the house, even though I was literally paying their bills and working more hours than both my parents combined. That smug little look on his face made my blood boil, but I couldn't do anything about it without risking another explosion from Dad. Rebecca would sometimes slip me an energy drink or cover one of my chores when she saw how exhausted I was. She was the only person in the house who seemed to recognize the insanity of our situation. But she was heading to university soon and had her own stuff to deal with. Applications, scholarships, planning her escape. I couldn't blame her for focusing on her own future. At least one of us had to get out intact. The worst part wasn't even how physically and mentally exhausted I was all the time. It was knowing that nothing I did would ever be good enough. Tommy could literally fart the national anthem, and my parents would praise him for his musical talent. Meanwhile, I could work myself to death and still be the family disappointment. That knowledge wore on me more than the lack of sleep or the constant work. I remember this one time I fixed Dad's truck when the alternator was completely dead. It was his work truck, and he needed it for a job the next day. I spent my entire Saturday working on it, got covered in grease, cut up my hands on the engine parts, and had to figure out how to do it with just the basic tools we had in the garage. By some miracle, I got it running perfectly. Dad's response? Took you long enough. Not a thank you, not a word of appreciation, just criticism that I hadn't fixed it faster. The next day, Tommy took out the garbage, a 5-minute chore at most. And I swear to you, my dad went on for 20 minutes about how his son was becoming a responsible young man and how proud he was. The double standard was absolutely insane. Then came the final straw about 2 months after graduation. I had just finished a double shift at the diner where I'd been picking up extra hours. Got home around midnight, dead on my feet. All I wanted was to crash for a few hours before my morning shift at the grocery store. When I walked into my room, I found Tommy wearing my only decent pair of work boots, tracking mud all over my floor. These weren't fancy boots or anything, but they cost me a full day's pay. And they were the only shoes I had that didn't destroy my feet during my 8-hour shifts standing on concrete floors. I was too tired to get into a fight, so I just told him to take them off and clean up his mess. The little shit just smirked at me, then deliberately stomped in the muddy puddle he'd made on my floor, making it worse. That's when I lost it. All the pent-up frustration and anger from years of unfair treatment came pouring out, and I started yelling at him. Dad must have heard the commotion because he came storming into my room like I was trying to murder his precious son. He didn't even ask what happened, just started screaming at me about respecting my brother's space. In my own damn room. I tried explaining that these were my work boots that I needed for my shift the next morning, but he wasn't listening. Instead, he grabbed the boots right off Tommy's feet and threw them straight in the trash. Then he told me to just buy another pair, like I could magically make money appear after giving him most of my paychecks for rent. That was it. I finally snapped. I told him exactly what I thought of his parenting. Called him a pathetic excuse for a father, one who got off on tearing me down while babying his precious golden child. I said everything I'd been holding back for years, all the resentment and hurt that had been building up. I told him Tommy was becoming a useless leech because of him, and that someday he'd regret raising a son who couldn't function in the real world. You should have seen what came next. Dad got right in my face, veins popping in his forehead, looking like he was about to explode. He was challenging me, hoping I'd swing first so he could justify what he was about to do. I didn't take the bait. I knew better, but it didn't matter. Dear old Dad decided it was time for a lesson in respect. Nothing says family love like your father beating the shit out of his adult son over a pair of work boots. He knocked me around the living room pretty good while Mom just took Tommy to another room. Heaven forbid the golden child witnessed Dad's anger issues. I managed to get out of it with just a bloody nose, a split lip, and what would become a pretty impressive black eye by the next morning. About a week later, something weird happened. Dad's whole attitude changed. He wasn't nice exactly, but he was less of a complete asshole than usual. He actually bought me new work boots without saying a word about our fight. Started asking about my jobs and even complimented me when I fixed the leaky bathroom faucet. I should have known something was up. Leopards don't change their spots. And my dad was basically a leopard with anger issues and a receding hairline. But when you've spent your whole life trying to get your dad's approval, even the smallest crumb looks like a feast. So I went along with it, thinking maybe getting my ass kicked had somehow been a turning point in our relationship. Maybe he'd finally seen me as a person rather than a disappointment. I know it sounds pathetic now, but I desperately wanted to believe things could change. Then one Friday, he came up with this plan for us to bond on a fishing trip. Just me and him, man to man. He said he realized I was working hard and wanted to reconnect before I moved on with my life. He actually seemed sincere, talking about this lake about 4 hours from home that was supposed to have great fishing. I've got to admit, part of me actually believed him. When you're raised by someone like my father, there's always this stupid little voice of hope inside you that whispers, maybe this time will be different. So I called in sick to both jobs, something I never did, and we packed up his truck and headed out early that morning. I thought I was about to get some Dr. Phil moment where my dad would open up, maybe apologize for the years of favoritism, and we'd forge a new relationship. Boy, was I wrong. The whole drive he was being weirdly normal, making small talk about the weather and sports. He didn't say anything meaningful, but I thought he was just putting his thoughts together. I figured it must be hard for him to be the good father after years of beating the shit out of me. So I gave him time. Then we stopped for gas in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing but trees for miles in every direction. No houses, no other businesses, just endless forest surrounding a small automated gas station. As soon as he put the truck in park, Dad's whole attitude changed. That fake normal act dropped instantly, and his face twisted into that familiar look of contempt I'd seen my entire life. Before I could even ask what was happening, he reached across me, flung open my door, and literally shoved me out of the truck. I stumbled and fell hard on the gravel parking lot. When I looked up confused, he was tossing my empty water bottle after me. "Time to man up for real," he sneered. "If you're tough enough to talk back to me, let's see if you're tough enough to find your own way home. Consider this your graduation present. Freedom from the family you're so ungrateful for." Then he laughed, adding, "Maybe out here you'll finally grow a pair, since nothing I've done has worked. Don't bother coming back until you do." I stood there with my ass in the dirt, watching as he revved the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, dust flying everywhere. My wallet, phone, everything, still in my backpack in his truck. That's when it hit me. This entire bonding trip had been planned from the start just to dump me in the middle of nowhere. It hit me like a punch to the gut. It finally sank in that my dad never wanted to fix our relationship. He just wanted to break me one last time. So there I was, standing in a cloud of dust, watching my dad's truck disappear down the road. The gas station was one of those automated ones with no store or attendant, just a couple of pumps with card readers. Literally nothing but trees and empty roads stretching in both directions. I was completely alone. After the initial shock wore off, I checked my pockets. I had maybe $23 in cash, some lint, and a pack of gum. No phone, no wallet, no water except the empty bottle he'd thrown at me. Not exactly ideal survival gear. The temperature was dropping too. It was mid-October, and while the days were still warm, nights got pretty cold in this part of the state. I spent a good 15 minutes just staring at the road, trying to figure out which direction might lead to civilization. Finally, I started walking with my thumb out whenever I heard a car approaching. Traffic was basically non-existent. Maybe one car every 45 minutes, and none of them stopped. I can't really blame them. Some random dude with a black eye on a deserted road doesn't exactly scream safe ride. After about 3 hours of walking, my feet were already starting to blister. I could feel that familiar raw spot forming on my heels, and my shoes, which weren't designed for long-distance walking, were rubbing my skin raw. The sun was starting to set, and I was beginning to wonder if I'd need to figure out how to sleep in the woods. Not gonna lie, that thought was pretty terrifying. I had zero survival skills and no supplies. Then I spotted something through the trees, what looked like another road about half a mile away. I cut through the forest, stumbling over roots and ducking under branches, and found this tiny convenience store attached to what looked like somebody's house. It was straight out of a horror movie. Peeling paint, flickering sign, the works, but beggars can't be choosers. The old dude behind the counter took one look at me and grimaced. My face was still messed up from the fight with Dad. I was covered in dust from the road, and I probably looked half dead from walking for hours. I made up some BS story about how my buddies had played a prank on me during a camping trip, leaving me behind as a joke. Not sure if he believed me, but he let me use the store phone. First, I tried calling home. Mom picked up, and I'll never forget what she said. I started explaining what Dad had done, expecting her to be shocked or worried or literally have any normal human reaction to learning her husband had abandoned their son in the middle of nowhere. Instead, she got all defensive. She said Dad had already called and told her the whole story about how I'd thrown a tantrum when he asked me to help unload the truck at the fishing spot. According to him, I needed to learn respect and be a man. It was complete fiction, but she ate it up without question. When I tried telling her the truth, that Dad had deliberately driven me to the middle of nowhere just to abandon me, she just said I needed to figure it out, and that I was old enough to handle myself. Then she actually hung up on me. That's when it really hit me. They were both totally fine with this. They had planned it together. I was never the son they wanted, so they were literally throwing me away. The store owner was giving me this look of pity, but I had to keep it together. I was about to call Rebecca, but knew she couldn't do much from her college campus, and I didn't want to put her in the middle of this mess. So I called the only person I knew would actually help, my Uncle Marcus, Dad's brother. They hadn't spoken in years because Uncle Marcus always called Dad out on his BS parenting style. Uncle Marcus had tried to stay in touch with me throughout my childhood, but Dad always made it difficult, saying his brother was a bad influence. I still had his number memorized, though. He picked up on the third ring. I just laid it all out. Where I was, what happened, everything. There was this long pause after I finished, and then he just said, "Stay where you are. I'll be there soon." No questions, no lecture, just immediate help. The store owner let me hang out until Uncle Marcus showed up. He even gave me a Mountain Dew and a sandwich on the house, saying I looked like I needed it, which was probably the understatement of the century. When Uncle Marcus's beat-up Dodge finally pulled into the parking lot, it was almost midnight. He took one look at me, dirty, exhausted, with my face still bruised from the earlier fight with Dad, and didn't say a word. He just gave me this brief nod and opened the passenger door. The drive back was mostly quiet. He asked if I needed medical attention. I said no. He asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said not yet. And that was it. No pressure, no interrogation, just a comfortable silence that felt more supportive than anything my parents had ever offered. About halfway back, I finally asked the question that had been bouncing around in my head all day. "Did you know my dad was like this?" "Always knew he was an ass," Uncle Marcus replied, eyes fixed on the road. "Didn't know he'd go this far." Then after a minute, he added, "Your dad was always jealous of anyone who didn't worship the ground he walked on." The simple truth of that statement hit me hard. It explained so much about how my father treated me versus Tommy. We drove the rest of the way to his place in silence. He lived in this small house about 2 hours from my parents. Nothing fancy, just a simple 3-bedroom ranch with a well-kept yard. He showed me to his spare room, which was really just an office with a pull-out couch, and said we'd figure things out in the morning. As I was about to crash, dead on my feet from the longest day of my life, he paused at the door and said something I'll never forget. "Your dad didn't know what to do with a son who could think for himself. That's his failure, not yours." Then he left me alone with my thoughts. I slept for 16 straight hours. The first decent sleep I'd had in months, maybe years. When I finally woke up, the events of the previous day came flooding back, and I had this strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It took me a while to realize it was freedom. That first week at Uncle Marcus's was weird as hell. Part of me kept hoping my phone would ring, Mom calling to check if I was okay, maybe even apologizing. It never did. The only family member who reached out was Rebecca. Her texts were super careful, like she was afraid someone would see them. Later, I found out my parents had told her I'd run away after a fight with Dad, and they were giving me space to cool off. Yeah, right. More like they were covering their asses in case anyone asked questions. Anyway, Uncle Marcus didn't waste time with pity parties. The day after I arrived, he took me to get a new ID since mine was in the backpack Dad drove off with. We had to go through this whole complicated process to prove who I was without documentation. What a pain in the ass. But Uncle Marcus didn't complain once about spending half his day off at the DMV. After getting my ID situation sorted, we set up a new bank account, one my parents couldn't access. I'd always had a joint account with my mom from when I was a minor, and I suddenly realized they could potentially drain whatever money I had left. Luckily, when we checked, they hadn't touched it yet, so we were able to transfer everything to the new account. On the third day, Uncle Marcus drove me back to town to collect my last paychecks from both jobs. That was awkward as hell. I had to explain to my managers why I suddenly disappeared and wouldn't be coming back. I didn't tell them the whole truth. Just said I had a family emergency and had to move. They were actually pretty understanding, though the manager at the diner tried to convince me to stay on part-time. I declined. I needed a clean break. Through all of this, Uncle Marcus never made me feel like a burden. He wasn't the warm, fuzzy type, more of an actions speak louder than words kind of guy. But he made space for me in his life without complaint. He never asked how long I planned to stay, or reminded me I was sleeping in his office. He just handled things with this quiet efficiency that I really came to respect. It was so different from the constant criticism I'd grown up with. About a week after I moved in, he mentioned there was an opening at the warehouse where he worked. Nothing glamorous, basically moving heavy stuff around all day, but it paid $16 an hour with actual benefits. That was nearly double what I made at the diner, plus no dealing with annoying customers. I jumped at the opportunity. The interview was pretty much just a formality. The manager was an old buddy of my uncle, and it was pretty clear I had the job before I walked in. Still had to do all the paperwork and drug testing, but by the end of the week, I was officially employed with a steady job that could actually support me. My first day on the warehouse floor was brutally physical. I thought I was in decent shape from all the manual labor I'd done growing up, but this was different. It was 10 hours of lifting, carrying, and stacking boxes in a building with crappy ventilation. By lunch, my shirt was soaked through with sweat. By the end of the shift, my back felt like someone had taken a baseball bat to it. When we got home, Uncle Marcus just tossed me some work gloves and said, "Tomorrow will be worse. The soreness takes a day to kick in." He wasn't wrong. I could barely get out of bed the next morning. But the weird thing was, as physically demanding as the job was, it was actually less stressful than my old situation. The older guys at the warehouse didn't treat me like crap. If they saw me struggling with something, they'd jump in and show me a better technique instead of calling me stupid or weak. Plus, the paycheck was solid. After taxes, I was clearing more than enough to start saving, even after giving Uncle Marcus some money for rent, which he tried to refuse, but I insisted. I was determined not to be a freeloader like my brother. I wanted to pay my own way. Speaking of my brother, I heard through Rebecca that he totaled Dad's truck 2 weeks after they dumped me. Apparently, he was driving drunk and wrapped it around a tree. Somehow he walked away with barely a scratch, and somehow my parents weren't even mad about it. Dad just fixed the truck, and Tommy faced 0 consequences. Classic. 3 months into working at the warehouse, I had enough saved up to buy this crappy car from one of the guys at work. It had 190,000 miles on it. The AC was completely dead, and the radio only picked up like 3 stations. But I needed it to get to work reliably. It was the first thing I ever owned outright, and despite its flaws, I was proud of it. Uncle Marcus helped me fix it up on weekends. He taught me how to change the oil, replace brake pads, and all that practical stuff my dad never bothered with. Those weekend repair sessions were more educational than anything my father had ever taught me. And Uncle Marcus never once made me feel stupid for not already knowing how to do these things. After 6 months of living with Uncle Marcus, I started looking at apartments. I found this tiny studio above a Chinese restaurant about 10 minutes from the warehouse. The constant cooking smells took some getting used to. The whole place perpetually smelled like sesame oil and fried rice. But the rent was cheap enough that I could afford it on my warehouse salary. I signed the lease and moved in with nothing but a mattress on the floor, a folding chair I'd bought at Walmart, and some dishes Uncle Marcus insisted I take from his house. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Nobody could charge me rent for living in my own space. Nobody could tell me I wasn't pulling my weight. For the first time in my life, I had complete independence. The next year was all about the grind. Work, save, improve my place little by little. I picked up furniture from thrift stores and yard sales. Found a decent couch someone was throwing out just because it had a small tear in one cushion. Started adding small touches that made the apartment feel like home. I also started hitting the gym regularly to build up my strength for work. I wasn't trying to get huge or anything, just wanted functional strength to make the warehouse job easier on my body. Between the regular workouts and hauling boxes at the factory all day, I put on about 25 pounds of muscle. I wasn't scrawny anymore, that's for sure. Uncle Marcus and I fell into this comfortable routine. I'd go over to his place most Sundays, and we'd watch whatever game was on, fix stuff around his house, or just hang out. He wasn't big on heart-to-hearts, but occasionally he'd drop these nuggets of wisdom that always hit hard. Little observations about life or work that showed just how much he understood about what really matters. Rebecca and I stayed in touch through all of this. She was away at college, which was good because it meant she didn't have to deal with our parents as much. She'd call maybe once a week, and we'd catch up. She'd fill me in on family gossip, how Tommy was flunking out of community college, but somehow it was the professor's fault. How Dad's contracting business was struggling, but he was too proud to change anything. I listened to these updates, but I felt strangely disconnected from it all, like she was talking about some TV show I used to watch but had lost interest in. These people didn't feel like my family anymore. They were characters in a story about someone else's life. Around the 1-year mark of being on my own, I got promoted at the warehouse to machine operator. It came with better pay and less heavy lifting, though I had to learn all these safety regulations and technical procedures. But I was good at that stuff. Turns out I had an aptitude for mechanical operations and problem solving that nobody in my family had ever bothered to notice or encourage. That first year on my own, the biggest change wasn't the external stuff like the job or the apartment. It was realizing that all the crap my dad had drilled into my head about me being weak or a disappointment was complete BS. Turns out I was pretty capable when not being actively sabotaged by the people who were supposed to support me. Who would have thought? So after that first year on my own, things started really coming together for me. By 25, I'd worked my way up to shift supervisor at the warehouse. The promotion meant serious responsibility and a nice bump in pay. Suddenly, I was in charge of scheduling, quality control, and making sure production quotas were met. I had about 18 guys working under me, some of them twice my age. That was awkward at first, especially with a couple of dudes who still saw me as Marcus's nephew rather than their boss. But I worked hard to earn their respect, making sure I knew every aspect of the job and wasn't asking anyone to do something I wouldn't do myself. Eventually, most of them came around. Around this time, I also started taking night classes at the community college, studying business management. Warehouse work was decent money, but I wasn't trying to destroy my body long-term like I saw happening with some of the older workers. Guys in their 50s with permanent back problems, hearing loss, and messed up joints from 30 years on the floor. No thanks. The classes were tough on top of working 50-plus hours a week, but way easier than when I was dealing with my dad's BS. I actually got straight A's for the first time in my life, which just reinforced what I'd been realizing. I wasn't the problem. My environment had been the problem. Meanwhile, Rebecca kept me updated on the family drama, which was getting better and better, or worse and worse depending on your perspective. Dad's contracting business was tanking. Turns out being an asshole to employees and customers eventually catches up with you. He'd lost some major accounts and was scrambling to stay afloat financially. Mom had to get a part-time job for the first time in her life, which she apparently complained about constantly, as if joining the workforce was some great injustice being done to her. But the real star of the show was Tommy. My golden brother had fully lived up to his potential as a complete screw-up. After dropping out of community college, he'd bounced between minimum wage jobs, never lasting more than a few months anywhere. He'd racked up 3 DUIs by age 23, lost his license, and was now completely dependent on our parents to drive him around like a teenager. Rebecca said he'd also developed a pretty serious pill problem, though of course my parents were in total denial about it. They'd find excuses for his glassy eyes or erratic behavior. He was tired, he was coming down with something, he was stressed. Never the obvious explanation that he was high as a kite. The best part? Every time Tommy screwed up, he'd blame someone else, and my parents would back him 100%. Boss fired him for constantly showing up late? The boss was out to get him. Got arrested for driving with a suspended license? The cop was targeting him unfairly. Failed a drug test for a warehouse job? The test was obviously wrong. The delusion was Olympic level. By 27, I was operations manager at the warehouse, overseeing 3 different shifts and basically running the place day to day. The owners were in their mid-60s and looking to semi-retire, so they were happy to offload more responsibility to someone competent. I had my own office and everything, a far cry from my days of stocking shelves and waiting tables. I'd also upgraded from my studio to a decent 2-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood, traded my beater Honda for a new Toyota Tundra, and had actual furniture that didn't come from Goodwill or the side of the road. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was comfortable and financially stable, all without a penny of help from my parents. Uncle Marcus was pretty much the only real family I acknowledged at this point. We still did our Sunday routine, and I tried to pay him back for everything he'd done for me, but he always shrugged it off. "Family doesn't keep score," he'd say. That hit hard considering how my actual parents had done nothing but keep score my whole life, tallying every perceived failure and disappointment. Rebecca graduated college and got a job in advertising about an hour from where I lived. She didn't move in with me or anything, but we'd meet up for dinner every couple of weeks. It was cool seeing her build her own life away from our parents. She was still in contact with them but kept them at arm's length, what she called her sanity distance. Then, at 29, I took the biggest risk of my life. The warehouse owners mentioned they were considering selling the business and retiring completely. After crunching numbers for weeks and meeting with a bank, I made them an offer. I couldn't afford to buy the whole operation outright, but I could swing a partnership deal with a path to majority ownership over time. They went for it, partly because they knew I could keep the place running smoothly and partly because training a new operations manager would have been a pain in the ass for them. 2 months of paperwork and meetings later, I owned 30% of the business where I'd started loading trucks. It was a surreal feeling signing those papers, like all the hard work and sacrifices were finally paying off in a tangible way. The first thing I did as part owner was hire Uncle Marcus as a senior consultant with a fat salary. The man deserved to get off the warehouse floor after 40 years of hard labor. He tried to refuse, saying he didn't need charity, but I told him it was smart business to keep his knowledge in-house. That got him to accept, though he still insisted on doing physical work sometimes, to keep from getting soft. The second thing I did was modernize everything. The previous owners had been dragging their feet on updating equipment and systems that hadn't changed since the 90s. I invested a chunk of capital in new machinery, better inventory management software, and improved safety measures. The workers were happier, production went up, and profits followed. My investment was already paying off within a year. Life was good. I had a career I was proud of, people who respected me, a comfortable place to live, and absolutely zero contact with the people who had tried to break me. Perfect ending, right? Except life doesn't wrap up in neat little bows like that. Rebecca called me on a Wednesday night, which wasn't our usual catch-up time, so I knew something was up. "Have you checked your email today?" she asked, sounding weird. I hadn't. I'd been in meetings all day, going over quarterly projections with the department heads. I pulled up my inbox while we were still on the phone and saw something from an address I didn't recognize. When I read it, my stomach dropped. After more than a decade of silence, my mother had found my work email and sent a message. Rebecca confirmed she'd gotten one too. "They're in trouble," she said, like serious trouble. Turned out my parents had gone from financially struggling to completely desperate. Dad's business had finally failed entirely. They'd taken out a second mortgage on the house years ago and were about to go into foreclosure. But the cherry on top of this shit sundae? They'd been gambling, a lot. Like pawned mom's wedding ring, a lot. Apparently, they'd convinced themselves they could dig out of the financial hole with one big win at the casino. And that's where Tommy came in. My brother, now 30 and still living at home, had racked up some serious debts with people you don't want to owe money to. He'd used my parents' credit cards without permission, forged Dad's signature on some loan documents, and generally brought the whole house of cards crashing down on all of them. Now they were facing the consequences together. The email was what you'd expect. Vague mentions of family emergencies and difficult times, without any actual accountability. Not a single, "we're sorry for abandoning you," or acknowledgement of the past. Just this assumption that blood would trump everything, and I'd rush to bail them out because we were family. I deleted the email without replying and told Rebecca I wasn't getting involved. She understood but seemed stressed. They were putting pressure on her to talk sense into me, since she was the only one still in contact with both sides. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because I felt guilty, I didn't owe them a damn thing, but because I kept thinking how predictable this all was. Everything falling apart for them was the natural consequence of how they'd lived their lives. My dad spent years tearing me down while propping up Tommy as the golden child. Now I was thriving while Tommy had destroyed himself and taken them down with him. It was almost too perfect, like a movie script about karma. 3 days later, my work phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Thomas, it's your mother." And that's when the real drama began. For a second, I just sat there in my office chair, stunned. I hadn't heard her voice in over a decade. It sounded older, tired, but still had that same tone she'd always used when she wanted something. This fake sweet thing that made my skin crawl. "How did you get this number?" I finally asked. She ignored the question completely, just launched into this whole speech about how they were going through a rough time and needed to put the past behind us because family has to stick together. Classic manipulation tactics, trying to skip right over the part where they tossed me in the woods and pretended I didn't exist for 12 years. I let her talk without saying a word, partly because I was still processing that this was actually happening, and partly because I knew it would drive her crazy. My mom always hated silence. After about 3 minutes of her rambling justifications, she finally got to the point. They needed money. A lot of it. The house was going into foreclosure in 3 weeks. Dad's business was bankrupt, and Tommy had made some poor decisions that had financial consequences. I almost laughed at the euphemisms. "When's the last time you called me, Mom?" I asked. "To check if I was okay? Or maybe to see if I was alive?" She got defensive immediately. "You know how your father is. He has his pride. And you weren't exactly reaching out either." Unbelievable. In her twisted logic, I was the one who needed to reach out after they abandoned me in the middle of nowhere. The mental gymnastics required to maintain that perspective were Olympic level. "How much?" I asked, just to see what they thought I was worth. "We need $150,000 to clear everything up," she said, like she was asking to borrow $20. "We can work out a payment plan, of course." "Yeah, right." Like they'd ever pay back a dime. I told her I'd think about it and hung up. Then I called Rebecca, who confirmed everything Mom had said about their financial situation, but added the parts Mom had conveniently left out, like how they'd blown through their retirement fund at casinos and how Tommy had stolen their credit cards to pay off some seriously bad people. The situation was even worse than Mom had made it sound. The next week, Mom called every day, getting progressively more desperate with each voicemail. Dad never called himself. Too proud, I guess. But she kept saying he was concerned and wanted to make amends. I didn't believe that for a second. The man who had thrown me away like garbage wouldn't suddenly develop a conscience just because his bank account was empty. Finally, I decided to end this once and for all. I told Mom I'd meet them at my office that Friday to discuss options. I had zero intention of giving them money, but I wanted to see them face to face. Maybe part of me needed closure. Maybe I wanted them to see what I'd built without them. Either way, it was time to finish this chapter of my life. Friday came, and they showed up at the warehouse right on time. I watched them through my office window as they pulled up in a beat-up old Chrysler that had definitely seen better days. Dad had lost weight and had this defeated slump to his shoulders that I'd never seen before. Mom's hair had gone completely gray. They looked old, worn out. I had my assistant bring them to my office, enjoying the small power move. The look on their faces when they saw me sitting behind that big desk in my own office was almost worth all the shit they'd put me through. Dad's eyes darted around, taking in the awards on the wall, the view from the window overlooking the warehouse floor, all the signs that I'd done pretty damn well without him. Mom was doing that fake smile thing, probably already calculating how much she could squeeze out of me. "Thomas, you look good," she started, all sugary. "We've thought about you so often." I didn't bother with small talk. "Let's get to the point. You need $150,000 or you lose the house. Tommy screwed up again and you're out of options. That about cover it?" Dad finally spoke. "The economy hit my business hard. We made some investments that didn't pay off. He couldn't even admit they'd gambled it all away, still trying to save face. Rebecca told me everything, I said. About the casinos, about Tommy stealing your credit cards, about the second mortgage. That shut them up for a second. Mom recovered first. Everyone makes mistakes, she said. But we're family. Family helps each other through tough times. Funny how I wasn't family when you left me stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the clothes on my back, I replied. Or when Dad beat the shit out of me over a pair of work boots. Or when you hung up on me when I called for help. Dad's face got red. That was different. You needed to learn to be a man. And what did Tommy need to learn? I asked. When you bailed him out after every DUI, after he stole from you, after he totaled your truck. No answer to that, just uncomfortable shifting in their chairs. They couldn't justify the double standard. They never could. All right, I said calmly. You need $150,000 to get the house back, right? Fine. I'll give you $250,000. $150,000 to save the house. Another $100,000 for your retirement. They looked shocked. Then my mother smiled. That genuine smile she used to reserve only for Tommy when he'd done something impressive. Thomas, I knew you still cared about us, she said, reaching for my hand across the desk. However, I continued, pulling my hand back before she could touch it, I have one condition. I leaned forward in my chair. I will abandon you in the woods. If you can find your way out within 3 days, I'll give you the money. Dead silence. Mom's smile froze on her face. Then my father slammed his hand on the desk. You ungrateful little bastard, he shouted. This is how you treat your parents? I shrugged. Your choice. No one's forcing you. I reached for my desk phone to call security. Dad actually stood up, his face purple with rage. You ungrateful little. After everything we did for you, I cut him off. You mean like charging me rent at 18 while Tommy lived for free? Or abandoning me in the woods? Or telling Mom to hang up when I called for help? That's everything? Mom tried a different approach, all tears and manipulation. Thomas, please, we're about to be homeless. Tommy is in real trouble with dangerous people. I shrugged again. Your choice. No one's forcing you. I called security to escort them out. As they were being led away, my father was still yelling and my mother was crying dramatically, but I didn't feel a thing. And since that day, I've stopped hearing from them. They made their choice. After they left, I sat in my office for a long time, just processing what had happened. I thought I might feel bad or conflicted about my decision, but I didn't. I just felt done, like I'd finally closed a chapter that had been hanging open for too long. I called Rebecca that night to give her the rundown. She wasn't surprised either. She said they'd rather lose everything than admit they were wrong about anything. A year has passed since then. I'm doing great with my business, and I haven't heard from my parents again. Sometimes news still finds its way to me, though. Rebecca and I grab coffee together whenever she visits the area, and she occasionally updates me on the family situation. One day she told me my parents had lost everything. The house, the car, most of their possessions. I didn't ask for details. I didn't care. Do I feel bad about how things turned out for them? Not even a little. They made their choices, and I made mine. They threw me away expecting me to fail, but instead, I built something better than they ever had. The ultimate karma isn't taking something from them. It's succeeding so completely that they have to live with knowing what they threw away. Some bridges stay burned for a reason. For those wondering about Tommy, no, I haven't heard from him directly and don't plan to. We were never close even before all this went down. He was always just the golden child who delighted in making my life miserable. I have no interest in reconnecting with someone who took pleasure in my suffering for his entire life. Yes, I'm still part owner of the warehouse and business is good. We've expanded operations into a second facility and hired more staff. Uncle Marcus is semi-retired now, but still comes by to consult and have lunch with me a couple times a week. Rebecca and I remain close. She's the only blood relative I still consider family. For those saying I should have helped my parents anyway, because they're still your parents, hard disagree. DNA doesn't entitle you to exploit someone you've abused. They had a chance to own their mistakes and couldn't even do that. They didn't come to me with genuine remorse or acknowledgement of how they'd treated me. They came because they needed money, plain and simple. And no, I don't think I was too harsh with them. They literally abandoned me in the woods to teach me a lesson. Well, karma's a bitch, and sometimes the lesson comes back to teach the teacher. Looking back on everything now, I realized that the day my dad abandoned me, which felt like the worst day of my life at the time, was actually the beginning of my freedom. It forced me to build a life on my own terms, without the constant criticism and emotional abuse that had been my daily reality. I'm not saying I'm grateful for what they did, but I am grateful for who I've become despite it. Uncle Marcus says that some people go through life looking for someone to blame for their failures, while others just get on with the work of building something worthwhile. My father and brother were always the first type. I decided to be the second. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this. I'm no longer defined by their rejection. I'm defined by what I've built, by the relationships I've formed with people who actually value me, and by the knowledge that I broke the cycle of toxicity that defined my childhood. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you deserve. Sometimes you have to create your own definition of family. And sometimes the best revenge isn't confrontation. It's living well enough that when they finally come crawling back, you can look them in the eye and say, "No thanks, I'm good."